Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning in to another Martin Center online debate. My name is Dimitri Lilkov, Senior Research Officer at the Martin Center, and it's a pleasure for me to moderate today's debate. Our focus today is the renewal of the transatlantic relationship. The recently launched Trade and Technology Council aims to serve as a forum between the EU and the US to coordinate approaches to key global trade, economic, and technology issues. The Joint Forum aims to make progress on a wide-ranging set of topics, such as common technological standards, investment screening, securing supply chains, and even export controls, just to name a few. Expectations are high on both sides of the Atlantic that the TTC will be more than just an empty promise and more than just a high-level talk shop. And the history of transatlantic relations knows a lot of highs and a lot of lows when it comes to trade and technology. So it will be interesting to see if the TTC takes off as one of the essential pillars for joint US-EU cooperation. For today's panel, we have an excellent setup. Let me introduce to you our first speaker, Andreas Schwab, who is a member of the European Parliament, part of the EPP group. Mr. Schwab is part of the IMCO committee in Parliament and rapporteur of the landmark Digital Markets Act. Thanks for joining us, Andreas.
Good morning.
We also have Elena Melngale, a member of the cabinet of Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Valdis Dombrovskis, where Elena is responsible for relations with the US, Canada, WTO, and G7, G20 coordination as part of her portfolio. Last but not least, I'm really happy to be joined by Hanno Wulm, who is the Policy Director at the European Roundtable for Industry, which represents European industry and promotes European competitiveness. Thank you all for joining us. So without further ado, and before we start, just a little reminder to our audience that this is a live event. We will devote the last part of our conversation for Q&A. So, dear viewers, send us your questions and comments on YouTube, send us tweets, send us a fax if need be, and we'll address these questions by the end of our session. So, I want to kick off our panel, and I'll just shoot with a question to all three speakers. My main question is, how do you see the Trade and Technology Council developing in the future? And do you expect any ambitious breakthroughs in specific areas? Andreas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind invitation and for the possibility to speak here. It's a very interesting question and a very interesting moment to discuss about that question, as this Trade and Technology Council is brand new, as Commissioner Vestager is just over in the US, and as we see that there is already something new and constructive appearing. So the Trade and Technology Council is a tool that has been brought into life to cope with current discussions, with current elements of concerns of both sides of the Atlantic that we believe can best brought to a solution together, where we believe that technological developments in the last 15 years came to a record-breaking pace. The digital economy grew massively on both sides of the Atlantic, and we have both taken profit of this. And this has given rise to new business models, first in the United States, but also in Europe. And we have seen on both sides of the Atlantic very negative consequences of this. Christchurch being one, Capitol Hill on the 6th of January being something else. And also in Europe, there were some very difficult concerns and times that we had to face. And in general, we are continents, we are parts of the world that are based on the common principle of open democracy, of openness, and also fair treatment of people, fair treatment of businesses, allowing everyone to make his or her life and his or her case of the life in an open society, also in an economic term. And whilst it's also true that we have a bit of different approaches on some issues, in the end, both the United States and the EU want to make the digital transformation work for the citizens. We want to protect our model of social market economy. And I think that's even something that Donald Trump has done a bit less than Joe Biden, but we are united on this. And we believe in well-functioning and competitive markets, even though we have slight different concepts of what the concept of antitrust means. So we can learn from each other, not only on the digital regulation, also on trade and technology. And this council that we have set up is a tool to try to do so. Now, it's true, we have already had the transatlantic partnership discussions, and we had already the transatlantic economic business dialogue, and we have already had a lot of these meeting groups. And they are, in the end, just a tool to show to the public something which is happening between politicians of both sides of the Atlantic, struggling for the best solution in our common value and principle reflection. And I think we are totally committed as EPP group in the European Parliament to work on that, because I have to tell you at the end of that very short introduction at the beginning, the first people that came to my office in 2011, 2012 to say we have to do something on digital markets, it were American companies. It weren't Europeans, it weren't American companies, because they said, what's happening to us is unfair. This is not a level playing field. For sure, they were referring to the European market where they were both present with the giants, but they are all coming from the US. And therefore, I'm deeply convinced what we are discussing here is, first of all, an issue for the American economy. But as we are so united and as we are so integrated, in the end, it's a common issue, and therefore we have to try to fix it in a common sense.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I just want to jump in and follow up on something you highlighted, the differences. Now, in your view, Andreas, what are the chances of the US and the EU? I know you're positive on this, but can we actually align on joint technology standards on artificial intelligence, let's say, something so complex and ambitious? Can we align on that, given that, as you mentioned, we have our differences? And sometimes we don't really see eye to eye on topics such as digital governance, privacy, or taxation of digital companies. Is this possible?
You know, everything is possible in the life if you want to do it. And I think there is obviously a strong willingness on the side of the European Union, and I'm sure that Elena will speak later about that. But there is also a willingness on the side of the US, and I think we will also speak about that later. But making this in the end a concrete law is very difficult, because in the European Union we have 27 member states. They have a bit messy approaches on this and on that, and different feelings and traditions on others. And the Americans have a large economy with thousands of different players. And in the end, they are saying all politics is local. And I think somehow this is the truth. And therefore, the Americans will have to cope with that problem of trying to find, in the interest of their citizens and of their economy, common standards with the Europeans. And us, we have to do exactly the same. And that is the battle of the globalization. We will try to do that with the Americans, and we will find a solution. Maybe not a perfect one, but a very good one. And the difference to other regions in the world is we won't even try, and we will never find. And therefore, we should focus on what we can achieve, even if we are different, even if we have different democracies. And we have to see that there is strength in what we can achieve, and we should, let's say, work it out as best as we can.
Thank you. And I want to move to Elena. You're involved on high-level talks and discussions on trade. Walk us through how optimistic are you about the TPC, and how do you see it developing in the future?
Yeah, good morning, everybody, and indeed, thanks for inviting to this discussion today. And I can clearly echo everything what Andreas already said. From my side, maybe I walk you through kind of day-to-day work of the Trade and Tech Council, just to show you a bit more of the insights. First, what I wanted to say that the fact that the TTC exists at all is in itself a very big deal. In 12 months, we have moved from a place of antagonism and real trade tension to a more positive, collaborative, and forward-looking atmosphere. And this symbolic importance should not be underestimated. Moreover, the format of the Trade and Tech Council is both innovative and results-oriented. Now, in terms of content specifics, the first TTC meeting has delivered already first results, and you all have seen the Pittsburgh Statement and its 5 annexes. Just to recall, it was agreed that we would use the Trade and Tech Council as a platform to exchange views, to share best practices, and to cooperate on common challenges at the nexus of trade, technology, and security. What does it mean in practice? In practice, there are 10 working groups in the Trade and Tech Council that are spanning a broad range of policy issues, from standards cooperation to questions of digital governance, climate issues, and global trade challenges. We are looking at how we can address the shortcomings in supply chains, identify common regulatory approaches on sensitive technologies, and how we could boost trade in new or emerging technologies, but not putting any new barriers on it. At the same time, we're also working to enhance our cooperation in policy areas such as investment screening and export controls. We are looking at the policy area of green goods and services to demonstrate that trade can help climate policies and create business opportunities for clean technology, and specifically focusing on secure supply chains, particularly looking at semiconductors, clean energy, pharmaceuticals, and critical materials for our economies. We have kept our promise to make this process a transparent process. So we are involving stakeholders in every step of our discussions. For this, we have launched a website which is called Futurium, that serves as a one-stop shop to collect stakeholder input relating to the TTC work. And we strongly encourage constituencies and stakeholder organizations to register on this website and provide their input in the specific working groups. So where we are now, currently we are reflecting and discussing what could be the next set of deliverables for Trade and Tech Council. And we are looking at both shorter term and longer term outcomes. We believe that they should bring substantial policy and commercial benefits on both sides, as we want the Trade and Tech Council to be relevant, and we want it to become a durable format in our relations with the US. Maybe I'll stop here, and I'm ready to engage in further exchanges.
Quick follow-up. Indeed, I mean, the fact that we're at this point right now is quite something, given the rocky years during the previous US administration, especially when we talk about tariffs and trade. I just want to maybe comment on something a bit more specific. I also read the Pittsburgh statement communique after the first meeting, and indeed, there is a pledge to work on global trade challenges. Can you maybe specify exactly what do we mean here? Is it about labor rights? Is it about tariffs or some impediments to trade?
In Global Trade Challenges Working Group, we have identified 3 work streams. One is about how to deal with practices of non-market economies and how to bring our cooperation closer on this issue. Then we are looking at how to build a system which would allow to increase trade in new and future technologies while not creating any new barriers to trade. And then last but not least, two very pertinent issues are green and labor and sustainability, a nexus of Trade and Tech Council. And there we are looking at if we could do something together to make international labor standards stronger. And we are looking exactly what we can do to facilitate trade in green goods and services.
Thanks so much for the clarification. Last but not least, I want to jump to Hanno. How does the European industry see all of these processes developing? Hanno, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Dimitar. And indeed, from a European industry perspective, of course, we're extremely pleased about the launch of the TTC. And I think we need to keep in mind here actually how close the relationship already is. Despite a few rocky years, the transatlantic economy is extremely integrated. It's the biggest in the world, represents a third of global GDP. And business relationships are really closely entrenched, not only in trade, in goods and services, but also investment. And we are a forum of around 60 CEOs of major European companies. And they are deeply embedded in the American economy. For them, the transatlantic economy is absolutely crucial. And we've been calling for something like the TTC to be set up, and we're extremely pleased. And I can only agree with Elina that, we've already seen a lot of successes. The TTC launch as such, of course, and then, from a business perspective, it is also important to look at the broader transatlantic agenda, of course, because we appreciate that not all issues are part of the TTC, but there can, of course, be positive spillovers, and we see that there's a positive momentum, as we've seen with Airbus, Boeing, steel and aluminum tariffs, and of course, there's a few other things that we see that should be discussed, of course, and of course, you can discuss whether some issues should be part of the TTC or not. Data flows is a big one for us. Finding a sustainable solution on transatlantic data flows is of course absolutely vital, and that would be one of the areas we would say, well, that is one of these ambitious breakthroughs that we would love to see. But also understanding that, okay, if you look at it from a strict perspective, it wouldn't necessarily be part of the TTC. And I think from an institutional perspective, looking at that, I think a lot of lessons have been learned from previous experiences. Andreas referred to the Transatlantic Economy Council, TTIP, of course, and I think we now seem to have struck quite a good balance in terms of maybe what was in the past sometimes too ambitious. You try to have a trade agreement that was a single undertaking. Now it's more step-by-step approach. And you have these working groups where the relevant agencies are actually in the lead. So those are very positive developments in my view. But you don't leave things at the working level. You have the principles to really drive things, and that can of course deliver momentum. If you have a trade agreement, for example, of course the pressure in a way is higher because you want to sign an agreement. Now, of course, the outcomes are more difficult to measure. So it's important to have the support and buy-in at the highest level and to check it regularly. And we're very positive and optimistic that results can be achieved. And ironically, in a way, of course, what we've seen with TTIP is that it's very difficult to come together in areas where standards already exist. So these forward-looking areas, especially in the technology space, for us, those are the areas where we see a lot of potential. And it's good to see also from the Pittsburgh meeting that these areas have also been put top of the agenda. AI for us is absolutely crucial that both sides try to align approaches. And one of the key things there is, of course, that you have a close conversation, as was said before, exchange best practices, and have lessons learned. So, as I was saying, ironically, if you avoid barriers, avoid irritants from emerging, it's of course more difficult to, sell that or present that as a major breakthrough, but it will have prevented a lot of headaches. And that is something for us that's very important as well, to say this dialogue is very important, and that's also where the stakeholders come in. And I think that's also where the lessons have been learned from TTIP. We were very pleased to see a very good stakeholder engagement already around the Pittsburgh summit. Elena was referencing the online platform, and we as business, of course, stand ready to contribute. We work with our counterparts in the US, but also other civil society stakeholders need to be part of the conversation to make sure there's transparency and there's buy-in. So maybe I'll stop here.
You made a really good point about the potential linkages, for example, with data flows, that this type of cooperation and fora are useful for some other positive spillovers. But I want to actually go the exact opposite. Do you see any potential clashes materializing, especially when you talk about European industrial interests and American industrial interests when they meet through their political representatives at the TTC level? Or maybe these clashes will never happen because we're never going to talk about these issues at the TTC. How do you see it? Is there going to be any confrontational dynamic, and on what levels or on what topics?
Well, I mean, we all know that one of the key topics that's top of mind now, also with the votes in Parliament next week on DMA and DSA, of course, there have been difficult conversations, and that's why it's all the more important, in my view, to speak early and explain what the intentions are. And even in this area, you can see that maybe we're actually not so far apart. If you look at EVP Vestager's visit to DC, some feedback you get is that maybe in some areas we're closer together than might seem at first sight. And I think the same goes for other areas. It's important to have that conversation and get closer together, and not shy away from the difficult topics either. And that also, I think, shows the quality of the transatlantic relationship, that you can confront these issues head on. And that it's possible. So that's absolutely vital. One point I might actually add of what I missed a little bit, and would be interesting to get Elena's views as well, is the climate and green agenda. We know there's a working group, and of course it's being highlighted in the Pittsburgh statement, but it didn't seem to be one of these top 4 or 5 issues that have been highlighted. And for us, that's of course absolutely key. To address these issues, both in terms of investment and working together in clean tech, but also working together on carbon leakage and work on carbon pricing, and especially driving that global conversation together.
Hanno is actually opening up great topics and spillovers and linkages to other speakers, especially on climate. But by the way, I already see we have questions from the audience trickling in. But I'll just keep this on hold for a couple of minutes, and I want to jump back to Andreas, because Hanno made a good point right now. And Andreas, I mean, maybe for most of our viewers, they already know, but you are currently the rapporteur of the DMA file in European Parliament, which has a huge impact on US tech companies. Now, I'm going to ask you point blank, do you think that the TTC can be a forum, or already is a forum, where the US government is going to apply pressure so that our own European legislation is watered down? Mike, please.
Sorry. No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a format to exchange on concerns that are serious. And it's also a format to avoid to speak about concerns that are not serious. It's obvious that me and the EPP group in the European Parliament have an interest to keep our European, but also the global economy innovative. It's obvious that we have an interest to avoid too much bureaucracy. It's obvious that we have an interest to defend the freedom of service provision. But it's also clear that we defend data protection, cybersecurity. And now if you take all these values within the set of companies that are concerned there is first and foremost millions of companies in the US and in Europe that share this all and want us to do something on the biggest ones because they don't want to have these bottlenecks that struggle at their activities. And then there are the big ones, and they have all different concerns. Booking doesn't want to be treated unfairly. Apple doesn't want to be treated unfairly. They have all good arguments. Google doesn't want to be treated unfairly. Now, they have also some arguments, maybe not always good, but they have also some arguments, and we take them into consideration. And I think the format of the TTC can be a tool to speak about that in the open, to ask people if they criticize something to come up with arguments and not just to blame. And that is, I think, a very constructive tool. I think in the end, unfortunately, we have seen such tools already quite often. I don't believe that they will stop anything. I don't believe that they will have a real impact. They are a sign to the public what our democracies links, how strongly we share common values. And if it's just mentioned there, it's already a lot because it is important that people in Washington, but also in Minnesota and in Brussels, but also in Bavaria, see that even if sometimes there are some fights, we are very strongly based on common democratic values, and they will be defended together, even if sometimes it might be a bit of a concern. And I'm very deeply convinced that we will manage this, and I'm deeply convinced that the TTC will not have any negative impact on the laws. It will just create transparency and openness of thought, and that is very, very helpful.
Great, thanks for this clarification, and good luck with the upcoming votes on these important files, by the way, in Parliament. Quickly jumping to Elina, we already brushed upon TTIP. Maybe our viewers remember that we had, let's say, a bitter experience when we tried to come up with a joint trade and investment partnership agreement a couple of years ago. Elina, what was maybe the biggest obstacle for TTIP, and have we learned from our mistakes from a transatlantic perspective so that we don't repeat them during TTC?
And thank you for this question. First, I would like to emphasize that TTC is not a trade negotiation, and all of you have access to Pittsburgh Statement and can read what the mission of the TTC is. And Trade and Technology Council, in my view, should be used to nurture our relations with the US, because these are two most powerful and biggest economies in the world. And this is a key artery of the global economy. So talking specifically about TTIP, I don't think I can comment on the failed outcome of the TTIP negotiations. As I was not there, but I think what we see from from those who were there, that there are some lessons to be learned for future negotiations of this scale. And one lesson which I heard from colleagues who were there was that the stakeholders and civil society had expected a higher degree of transparency, and still I think this is the case today, and I think this is necessary and correct. I think another important lesson we should learn is that those who really support free, fair and rules-based trade must be more vocal in making the case for why it is important for our economies and our citizens. And TTIP was a failure of communication and persuasion as much as anything else. So also it implies that EU institutions should become more active and calling on key stakeholders to express their view and to support the cause of negotiating these type of trade agreements. And I would add one last point. Those constituencies who worked to oppose the TTIP should be aware of the consequences of their actions, because currently the non-existence of a trade agreement between the two biggest economies naturally leads to constant irritants, and this keeps us very, very busy.
I'm sure it does. Quickly jumping to Hanno about the question of transparency and involvement of European industry. Elena makes a really good point. This is not, a classic trade negotiation, but there are some lessons learned from previous experiences on different levels of communication and engagement. Now, Hanno, for you, exactly this question: how can European industry be better involved in this process? Do you have any worries, or how would you see that?
Thanks. Yeah, no, as I was alluding to earlier, I mean, we're off to a really good start. You do see indeed, and I agree with Elena on the experiences on transparency with TTIP. Lessons have been learned, and seeing from the stakeholder engagement so far, also by the dedicated working groups, you can see that there is a clear agenda around the principals meetings, but then also working groups setting up and gathering input, even during the times of COVID through video calls. So I think we have come a long way, and we're really pleased on how things are going. Of course, it's early days. It's not even been a year. But having said that, of course, momentum is key, and outcomes also have to be shown also for citizens that the work that is being done delivers real results. Of course, it is very important to keep that momentum. So it's not only at the highest political level, but of course, citizens and also businesses, of course, need to see the outcomes and need to see that they're positive results. As you were saying, you of course want to avoid just a simple talking shop. But from an industry perspective, I mean, we're pleased with the involvement. But of course, it's not only about the industry's views. Of course, it's all about all stakeholders that need to be part of the conversation. And I believe, as far as I can see, they are.
Okay. Now I'd like to maybe elevate the conversation a bit and look at the bigger picture and maybe touch upon geopolitics as well. We already have a question referring to China, and this is something I wanted to put up as a bigger framework from our discussion. Now, in late 2020, the European Commission published its call for a new transatlantic agenda right after the election of Joe Biden. And for some in Brussels, this was a classical Brussels love letter to Washington. The Commission listed a couple of potential areas for further transatlantic engagement: climate, COVID-19, trade, upholding democracy, you name it. This is extremely important and needed. And here is the first premise I like to put to you. The first premise is that the EU views the TTC as a natural continuation of these overall ideas, and it sees this forum as a linkage to other transatlantic topics, COVID, climate. It's an open tool. This is premise number one. Premise number two is that the Americans see this completely differently. The Americans are saying, yeah, I mean, we agree on these things, climate, COVID, these are important, but our main attitude here and our main intention is containing China's rise. So the second premise is that the US views the TTC only as a limited tool for US-EU cooperation for suppressing the rise of an Asian hegemon who wants to dominate America's supremacy in the global order. So the Americans see this as a closed tool for cooperation. So this is an open question to all speakers. Which premise holds, or maybe we can meet them and they're both valid. Both the EU sees this as a linkage to other bigger topics, or the Americans actually see it as a closed tool? Andreas, what do you think? What are the incentives behind this for Washington and Brussels?
Well, I think we should lead this discussion always in a positive direction. And the positive direction we have, and I think we share it with the Americans, is that democracy matters, openness, transparency matters, fairness is a conditio sine qua non. And this is not exclusive to us and the Americans. Everyone who wants to join us is welcome. So far, we are very proud that we can share these values totally with our American counterparts, even though there are sometimes discussions, sometimes different point of views. And secondly, I believe we should not link trade openness to some specific form of agreements. I think these agreements, these values, these commitments that we have, they are there and they will be there and they have to be there. And there is not anything that we will give up because of trade advantages. And we will not allow trade advantages to partners that don't respect these values. So trade is an important element. And this is in a globalized world a need for everyone. But our values cannot be jeopardized because of trade advantages. And therefore, I think we speak about trade with the Americans because we share the same values, but we don't speak about trade because we are ready to impede or to limit our values. That will not be something that the Americans want to do, and they will never do so. And it's not something that we do. And therefore, I think we are understanding each other very well. And therefore, all the proposals that I've seen from the US saying, yeah, we have to link trade and our technology cooperation is a bit messy. We have our values and we are strong believers in them. And we are sharing them with all of the world that wants to co-sign to the same values. And we have in a different box the trade issues, where we more and more also have to check that these values are respected, but we cannot mix it up. And I think that is sometimes also a risk in the US, in the debate, that some people say, yeah, but we could make, let's say, trade-offs. I think that's not easily possible.
Okay. Hanno, jumping to you, your thoughts on this, and I just want to quote, we have a couple of questions, and the first one refers to China. How is this partnership going to develop in the next few years, taking into account the rise and consolidation of China as a major player of the global economy? So let's add in Asia here. Hanno, what do you think?
Yeah, indeed. I can only agree with Andreas. Of course, the whole transatlantic relationship and the joint efforts, of course, based on shared values, and that's the foundation of what we do together. And maybe just as important as the transatlantic economy or strengthening integration of the transatlantic economy is the global perspective. Of course, the transatlantic economy is very big, but it's not separate from the world. So working together and driving efforts to set global standards based on our shared values, that is ultimately one of the key goals. And I think that's where the US and the EU are really very much aligned on a lot of issues. And we've been following with a lot of interest, for example, the work on global trade challenges, which also links to efforts we've seen before on the trilateral ministers initiative between the EU, US, and Japan, where a lot of work has been done already on industrial subsidies, for example, and dealing with all of these issues of unfair practices and practices of non-market economies. That's an initiative we've been supporting also together with our American counterparts to say this shouldn't only be a transatlantic thing, but the EU and US can work together to really also drive efforts in the WTO. And that's where the reform is needed to work on some of these challenges and imbalances we see. And that's where we need to see reform. And we're encouraged by some of the progress we've seen, and very pleased that has also been made one of the priorities already of the Pittsburgh meeting. And so again, transatlantic integration is one point, but it's really the global perspective. It's driving efforts in the WTO, but also G20, OECD, to ideally find global solutions to challenges you see. Supply chain due diligence is one example where we'd like to see more cooperation going forward based on international standards. Of course, so that's absolutely vital on that front. And that of course means, if I just mention one example that we don't really see out of the TTC yet, but like to see more momentum, is of course talking about the multilateral systems, the appellate body of the WTO. We would really like to see the US and EU really make progress as well, that we can move forward on that front.
Yeah, I really agree, and I thank you for the point you made about global standards and setting technological standards which correspond with our values, our EU values. And this is not just an open phrase, but we need this, especially given developments the last couple of years, where a certain model coming from China and Chinese technological companies and even Chinese software, which goes in the exact opposite direction, and the Chinese are raising their influence in Asia and Africa. So we need to oppose this. Yes, Hanno?
If I may just jump in to also say that, in our view, decoupling, because that is of course something that's talked about a lot, decoupling is not the answer either. So for us, it's global solutions. For European industry and for European growth and jobs, of course, the relationship with China is extremely important as well. So decoupling is not the answer for us. We need to engage and have difficult conversations, find common ground, and work towards achieving results and outcomes.
Okay. Well, we have a couple of other questions trickling in, but before that, I want to turn to Elina and again ask you on China, because reading through the statement from Pittsburgh, when we talk about the common challenges, when we talk about labor rights, supply chains, these topics are hinting at China, aren't they? Walk us through it.
Yeah, thank you for your question. On yeah, we received quite often this question whether TTC would be aimed against China, but I would like to say that TTC has been established primarily to strengthen the EU-US cooperation on trade and investment, and of course on setting the standards as you rightly mentioned before me. And also, to be more precise, the TTC doesn't have any working strand on China or aimed against China. Having said that, given that the TTC touched upon a broad range of issues, some topics, of course, could also be relevant for China. For example, this is rather well known that EU and US share concerns about the distortions to the international economy and trade that can be result of the practices of non-market economies. And as already mentioned, in the form of industrial subsidies, lack of market opening, or business practices of state-owned enterprises. So all of those issues are there on the agenda, but it's really as said by Hanno, it's all about making EU and US stronger on these issues.
Thank you very much for this clarification. We have a question from James Davidson. So now I'll just quickly move also to Q&A and combine it with our closing statements maybe. And I would like to pose this question directly to Andreas. And the question is the following. James Davidson asks, the fact that both France and Germany support the idea of technological sovereignty in recent years poses the question of how invested actually are European bigger political powers in the TTC success. basically the question is, if Paris and Berlin want to see Europe technologically sovereign, are they actually invested in TTC, or maybe minimal success? Andreas, what do you think?
I believe that France and Germany, and I have also to say to you that Emmanuel Macron is a very outspoken transatlantic. That's the reason why he was so deeply disappointed with the deal that has been happening with Australia. The Germans, also the new government, even I come from a totally different background, and I'm very critical about a lot of stuff they will be doing. They are very deeply transatlantic. And we have allowed the American companies to enter our daily life as no other company has ever done. We have allowed to know more about them we have allowed them to know more about us than we know ourselves. But in every country, there is also the principle that for the enforcement of the law, you have to be able to do it yourself. If there is a terrorist attack, it cannot be that we have to call Facebook to give us some information. We have to fix it ourselves. And there will be never, ever a concession on this. And therefore, I think what the Americans claim for themselves, what we have to respect and what we do respect, we have to claim as well. And now with data, this is a bit difficult because for sure, these companies have offered a wide range of possibilities to communicate that we have never had before. The innovative part of their business in the last 20 years has been immense. But there are now some elements, and I don't know if you have read, or if the guy who is asking the question has read the book, The Circle. We are now more and more coming to a situation, by the way, also the United States of America, where these companies could act like states. They want to build money. They want to create personalities. They want to create whatever. And their democracies, and we are also democracies like the Americans, have to stand up. And I see it in Congress. They have exactly the same reflections as we have. I have just recently had a discussion with David Cicilline from Congress last week with Ethno and the Financial Times, and he said January 6th of 2021 with the Capitol Hill upheaval would not have happened if we were better on tech regulation. And it's true. It's just like that. That doesn't mean that we want to ban them from the market. It doesn't mean that we want to block access to their services, but it means that we have to have an overview, like in the old world where the police was driving in the streets, checking that there are no gangsters. We have to do exactly the same in the internet. And this is something that we share. There is no disagreement. Therefore, I don't think if Germany and France speak about sovereignty, they want to negatively impact this cooperation. I think also Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are very grateful that we mention this. Sometimes I think they would ask to be a bit more prudent. That can be. But in the deepest reflection they have, they share that also smaller countries should be able to defend their sovereignty in the 21st century. And they know that they can only do it within the European Union. And therefore, the European Union has to help all 27 countries to defend these values, but not against the US, but together with the US against companies that that create an environment which is a bit trespassing into the powers of the states, and that we will defend together. And all countries of the world that have the same borders of state and private companies, have the same democratic values, are invited to do the same. That is not unilateral with the US, but it's unique because with the US we have that common belief since centuries, and I believe it will also be in the next decade the same, and therefore it's unique but not unilateral.
Really, really emphatic points. Two very quick comments. First comment about the book, fantastic movie, also The Circle with Emma Watson. Everybody should watch it. Second comment quickly, on President Macron's transatlantic agenda and commitment, I don't question that, but I just remember how the French administration informally tried to take TTC, the first TTC meeting, hostage, exactly because President Macron didn't secure a certain submarine deal with the Australians and the Brits. Anyways, we are running out of time. We're touching upon really interesting topics here. I just want to make sure that I respond to all questions coming from our audience, and we have a good one. This I'll pose to Elina and Hanno because we already touched upon climate change very briefly. The question is the follows. The struggle against climate change has become a priority for the EU and the US. What are the prospects of transforming these TTC partnerships with a green perspective? So where does climate and environment add up when we talk about TTC? Maybe starting with Hanno and then Elina. And then also if you have any closing remarks as we have 5 or 6 minutes or so.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, indeed, I mean, this is something where I'd like to see also more momentum, maybe. And I mean, Elina can speak to what's already happening in case, you know, I misrepresent that. But this is really one of the key issues, and we know for the Commission and the EU, of course, as well. The transition is vital, and of course, the digital transition drives the green transition. So for us, making that the core of the TTC makes, of course, a lot of sense. And we need to act urgently. And again, that also leads not only to transatlantic action, but globally. So we'd like to see you know, initiatives or efforts coming out of the transatlantic efforts, whether it be in the TTC or elsewhere, to work together on carbon leakage challenges. And other things like the taxonomy, for example, you know, to align efforts there, and also the broader sustainability agenda, of course. You know, carbon accounting. There's a lot on that front that can be done, and it can only work globally.
Elina, TTC, climate, how do you see it?
We have a dedicated working group on clean tech. The process is the following. All the working groups are now finalizing their scoping exercises, and finalizing their terms of reference, and we will see a more concrete frame of how we are going to deal with these issues, I think early next year. This is definitely very high on our agenda. We have already passed this message to our US counterparts, emphasizing that we want to do more on climate, clean tech, also trade of green goods and services. And we hope that this will be picked up by the American side as well. Very concretely, as part of the agreement on 232 tariffs on steel and aluminium, we are starting discussions on a new global arrangement on sustainable steel and aluminium. And this is something which I hope will become a tangible result. Also, it's been dealt separately from the TTC. At the same time, it will aim at accelerating decarbonization of these industries and dealing with the overcapacity in this area. Thank you.
Just want to give the floor very quickly to Andreas if he wants to add any wrap-up comment or final thoughts on all of this.
Well, first of all, I think Europe in this time of the globalization needs to stand firm on its own values, which is not easy with 27 member states, rotating presidencies and so on. But I think we have strong values and we are able to defend them together. And the whole world is invited to share them with us. These are not our values. These are the values that we stand for, but they can be shared. And if we speak about clean tech and green energy, we have to be careful not to overestimate ourselves. In the long run, this can only be done if there is an innovation all over the world. And I think that the Americans have at least as many innovations in that area as the Europeans. And I think we have just to share the common commitment to the Paris Agreement. But then I think the Americans will make an amazing contribution to this. And we should not always believe that the Europeans are the best ones. We are not, unfortunately. And thirdly, I want to say we will work hard to speak to our American counterparts also as parliamentarians. I will go after the week in Strasbourg myself to Washington and to speak individually with them to explain that what we are doing is in our common interest, because it's done to make sure that small new companies that have innovation to be bringing to the market have a chance to do so, and are not just bought away by the big companies or are just brought into bottlenecks where they cannot survive. And this is something where the Americans are strongly believing in, and it's something where the Europeans are believing in, and therefore together we can make it. And if other parts of the world want to join us there, it's first starting with values and then with trade agreements, then they are invited. And I think that should be a bit a positive message, not speaking negative or overcritically about others, focusing on our own values, how we implement them, what our partners do together with us, and then we go off like that.
Fantastic. It's 11 o'clock on the button, so I'd like to quickly wrap up our debate from today. There is huge political appetite on both sides of the Atlantic to make TTC a success. It's really positive, and I'm really happy that we've moved away from the animosity of trade disputes from the last couple of years. And we see a different and more positive approach in terms of transparency, common goals, and maybe even a bit more nuanced and niche understanding of specific topics of joint concern. Our panelists reminded us that it's important to work on global standard setting, especially on technology, which corresponds with US and EU values. And even though the TTC doesn't target China explicitly, the US and the EU share certain concerns when it comes to market access, industrial subsidies, or the negative practices of state-owned enterprises in China. So these issues are of joint concern, and hopefully there will be a way to tackle them somehow through this partnership, hopefully. And finally, I think it's great that our very own rapporteur from Parliament, from the DPP, reminded us that, you know, even though we have joint commitments and we want to come up with joint solutions, this doesn't mean that the EU will not continue to uphold its efforts, and we should remain digitally sovereign to make our own decisions and regulate on important questions which are important for our citizens when it comes to privacy, let's say competition, or even online content. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you very much, Hanno, Andreas, Elina, for this great debate. Stay tuned to the Martin Center and have a great day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.